Hi, this is Sean Hafer, and welcome to this sort of part 2 of our tutorial on creating a clock out of primitives in Cinema 4D. In this tutorial, we are going to move forward with our clock. We're going to apply some materials, create and apply materials for the hands, for the clock itself, the clock face. We're going to create a sky object and apply a material for that to give us some nice reflections. We are going to create some lights, and then we are going to render it out with a couple views that we will use by creating different cameras. And so let's get started. So I'm starting off where I left off here with our primitive clock. And what we want to do first, let's create a few materials, and we're going to start with our clock hands. So what I'm going to do is grab my minute hand of my clock, and I could turn everything off just so I see my minute hand. But what I want to do is make sure that everything's still on for easy checks. So another way we can do this, besides using our stoplights, is we can use our sort of solo tool over here. So I can come over with a minute hand selected and hit solo, the second one down, solo single, and in our viewport, it'll just show it. Now, if I render, everything will come back, right? So we've got everything, but for this, in this case, we've got, while we're working, we can just see that one object. So that's a really handy tool to use. Now, if you ever are doing that and all of a sudden you're like, wait, what happened to everything? Just come up here and that'll turn it off, and then you'll be in a good spot, all right? And we'll be using this off and on through different tutorials to get into some of the different techniques you can use or different modes as well. But for this case, we're just going to do solo single with a minute hand selected, and we'll see where that's at. Now, when we look at this minute hand, okay, so I'm in my front view here, I can see that my minute hand is centered up on 0 and 0, right? So here's our X, here's our Y, and it's on the origin. We moved it a little bit forward, but right now, but down here in our attributes manager, it's saying it's at 21.766 on the Y. And what's going on is we had moved our clock around in the last video, right? We'd actually moved that up. And since we moved that null, it has moved the position of everything. Now, the thing is, when we clicked on our minute hand, it's telling us it's 0, 0, but here it's saying 021, the same as the clock. So what it is, this mode with object relative is saying what it is in relation to its parent, all right? So what we can do here to change this, if we come down and just do world axis, right? So what I did, now we're using the world axis, which is our mode here. It will now give us the 0, 0, okay? So as we change these things, that'll keep us in the mode. So now if I hit clock will say 2176, which is where it is, but instead of the minute hand now saying negative 2176, right, because it's down at 0, 0, it's going to say 0. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so as we move here, we're going to go ahead and create a new material for our minute hand. So I'm going to come down into my object manager down here and just double click, and that'll create a new material. You can see in our attributes manager, we've got a material here. You can also double click the icon once you create it, and it will open a new window, which I feel is a little easier to use. I'll jump back and forth and do different ones, depending how I'm working and where I'm at and what I need to change. But in this case, starting off, we'll go ahead and double click it and open it up in its own material editor window. So right here's the name of our material. We'll call it minute hand. And we will look at what we've got here. So we've got a color channel, a reflectance channel on by default. In our case, we're going to turn off the reflectance for now. I'm not going to worry about that right now. And our color channel, this is where we would change the color, right? It makes sense. So we could come up here and pick a color. But what we're going to do is we're going to load in an image to use with an alpha channel, so that's a transparency of an image, to create the shape of the hand inside of the one, polygon basically we've got of this plane. So in the color to do that, I just come down to texture and I click on these little 3 dots, our little ellipses over here, and then I can load in. So what I've got here is there's a link to the clockbits.zip file. You can download that. And then inside of there, once you unzip it, we've got a couple images we'll use in this. So here's just an example of the clock rendered out, some other things, clock face, bump map, etc. But what we want to do, since we're on our minute hand, grab minute hand. It's a PNG file with transparency and hit open. Now here, the image is not in the project search path. Do you want to create a copy at the project location? So the way this works, when we first set up our file in the last tutorial, I said you can either just save the file or you can save the file with assets. When we saved the file with assets, it created a folder named the same as the file name, and then inside it put in our C4D file, our actual clockprimitives.c4d file. And I mentioned that if you had textures, it would have a texture TEX folder, and then all textures would be in that folder. So in this case, we haven't had a texture yet. So what I want to do in my case is I'm going to hit yes. And what this will do is it will create a copy of this PNG inside of that folder. So if I open up my desktop window here and bring it over and I come into our C4D clock primitives folder, there's our Cinema 4D file we're working in right now. And then you can see it now created a TEX file, a texture folder. And inside that, we've got a copy of our minute hand. Now that minute hand is still in our clock bits folder, right? It's still here, didn't move it, it just copied it. So you want to think about how your organization is going to be, right? So if you want to have all of your texture maps on a server and you want to just link to those, then you would say no. And if those are never going to move and everything is always going to be on a certain drive or a server or whatever, then you can just create those links. Now, the thing is, if someone moves that file or you delete that file, then it's going to be a broken link and you're not going to have that texture map. So but if you create copies every time, then you're going to have, 20 versions of that across your computer. So it's up to you on how you choose to organize that. Sometimes I will use the linked files to my texture drive, but then when I save it out to archive the whole project, I'll save it with assets. It'll collect all those, and then I'll have that one folder with my text folder inside that with all my texture maps. Okay, so that'll be up to you on how you want to do the workflow. In this case, we'll be copying them over into our project folder. All right, so now we see this, but we don't see that clock hand. We just see a black color here, basically, right? And we can see it's that rectangular shape, so that's fine. So what we now need to do is add that alpha transparency in. So to do that, we want to come down here to the alpha channel and turn that on. And we need to load in that same image, or if we had a separate image that was just the alpha channel, the grayscale image that produces transparency, we would go ahead and pull that in. So what I'm going to do, I could use my ellipses and go find that again, but I'm going to, since I've loaded it in, Cinema knows all the textures that we're using so far, all of the bitmaps, right, that we've loaded in. And by bitmap, that could be a BMP, it could be a PSD, it could be a JPEG, it could be a PNG, right? A TIFF. So that's what Cinema refers to as bitmap. They're all bitmap images. So if I come down here, hit this little pull down, now we can see it's got minutehand.png in here. So I can just use it that way without having to go look for it again. So now we can see it's got its transparency. All right, that looks great. So I'm going to close that. And now let's drag this material onto our minute hand. And we can see we've got, if I render here, we've got our minute hand. Now it's a little bit far back, right? So I'm going to go ahead and move that forward so we can see it. And now we should be able to see it okay. There we go. So there's our minute hand. So that alpha channel created that transparency for us. Now what we want to do is center this up, but you need to think about how we are going to, and I'm going to go ahead and unsolo everything right now by clicking over here on my S. We need to think about how we are going to line this up. So I'm going to go to my front view and I want to see all my textures. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to my display and go to my road shading lines, or you can go quick shading lines, depending how fast or slow your computer is. And I'm going to zoom in a little. And what we want to do is move our axis up to the center of that hole so that we know we can line that up right to the center of our clock. And then if we rotate the hands, it'll rotate around that center axis. Since this is parametric, right, it is still being created based off of its center point. If I come over to my axis tool, remember we used this in the past, we talked about it. If I come over to my axis tool and I start to move that up, it's going to move everything because it's being created from the axis. You can't move the axis inside of something that's parametric. So I'm going to undo. So we're back at 0 here. And what I need to do is make this editable. So I can click on this. I can either come over to this icon up here, make editable, or you can hit the letter C. And what that does is it turns this parametric object into points, polygons, and edges. So if I do this, we now basically have one polygon. We no longer have the icon of the plane, right? Up here on the hour hand, we saw that icon, but here it's just a 3-sided polygon, little triangle. And we no longer have our options down here as far as subdivisions and all of that. And we'll get more into that when we get into other modeling techniques. But just for now, no, we no longer can change any of the features except for actually moving edges, points, faces around, etc. Okay. So now that I've got that minute hand selected, I've got my axis tool selected. Now I can drag that axis up, and I'm just going to eyeball it in here and get that in the center of our clock hand. All right. So, and then I want to make sure I turn that off. Now, if I go back to my object in my move tool, when I move that, that'll move the hand from that center point. And if I hit R for my rotation tool and I start rotating, we can see that clock hand will rotate around the center point that we want. So the thing now is we know our clock was modeled at 0. So I can just click my minute hand, make sure I'm in my model tool up here, right? Axis tool is off. And I just want to set this down here to 0 in the Y. Now we're lined up and centered. I'll go back to my move tool and we can see that hand is right there. If I render, it's centered up and we're good to go. So let's do the same thing with the hour hand real quick. So we need to create a new material. I'm going to go into that material by double clicking it. I am going to change that to hour hand. And now let's, our color channel, we will load in the hour hand texture. And again here, I'm going to hit open and I will say yes, so it will move it over into my folder. And remember, we'll turn off reflectance, but then we'll turn on alpha and then load that back in. So now if I just do the pull down, if I go to bitmaps, both of mine are in here that we've used. So we want to just make sure we grab the right one, hour hand. That looks great. Close that out. And then we can grab hour hand, drag it on the hour hand. So we can drag it here, or we can also just drag it up here in the object manager onto the actual name, hour hand. And you can see every time we create and drag a material on, it adds a material tag, and those will come in handy later. But right now, just sort of notice those things as we create. So now this hour hand, same thing. We need to move our axis up. So we need to make it editable. So I can just hit C or click on this icon over here. So make editable. We can tell it's editable because it's now a polygon icon up here. And then let's go to our axis tool, zoom in a little, bring it up, center it up as close, eyeball it, and go ahead, turn off our axis tool and set that to 0 in the Y. Now they're lined up. They'll both rotate around that center point now. So this is a great time to save, file, save project. And now we are good to go. We've got 2 hands. So if we do a little render, we can see we've got our clock hands. Now we've got our glass still on here. So let's go ahead next up and just create a little transparent material for our glass. So I'm going to go ahead and double click, create a material, and we will say this one, we'll call it glass. And we will come in here and turn off our color channel. And in our reflectance channel, we can actually turn that off for now too. Let's go into transparency. So just all we have on right now is transparency. And if we click on that, we can see some options here. By default, it gave us a refraction preset of glass. Refraction is basically the way light bends through transparent materials. So if you think about a glass vase or and you look through the curves and everything, waves and warbles, that's refraction. So refraction, this is also called a refraction index. And what that is sort of what's here. So there are presets in Cinema for different ones, or you can set your own number. But by default, we're set at glass, and that's perfect. The one thing we want to do is bring our brightness down maybe to something like 95%. Just give it a little bit of viewability, so it's not totally 100% transparent. And maybe I'll make that, that should be fine. We'll see what 95 does. And that looks great. And then what we can do now is close this out, and we will drag that onto our glass here. And we can turn that back on now. And we can see through that, and everything should be good. Now let's look at how our clock and everything is set up, and we can start organizing, maybe moving a few things to make sure we're good. So if we're in our top view here, I can see that we've got our glass, which would be at the front, and I am going to move that a little forward. So I'm going to go ahead and select the glass, make sure I'm in my model tool, and move that a little forward so it's closer to the front. All right, that seems good. Now I want to look at where my clock face is. So that's back here. So that's fine. And maybe I'll move that a little bit forward. All right. And then our center post, let me move that a little bit back. Now again, I am just rolling over an axis. So my z-axis in this case, so that it turns white, and then I can just drag in that axis. Another way you can do that is if you come up here, you can turn off different axes. So if I knew I only wanted to move this in the Z, I could turn off my Y and my X, then I could click anywhere and drag, and all I could do is move in the Z. So that's something to remember. If again, you use any of these, sometimes you might end up, all of a sudden you can't move something on the X and you don't know why. Always double check your sort of limitations up here on where you can move or rotate. All right, so now I've got that sticking through a little bit. That looks fine. It's not hitting my glass, so that's great. And now let's go over here and just a little render, see what we're at. Now let's move our hands back in space. Our hands are way out here. So I'm going to take my hour hand and move that back onto this post. And then I don't know which hand usually goes in front, so we'll put the hour hand behind. And then I'll grab my minute hand and do the same thing. Now you can see here in my top view, it's out of my view. I can't grab it, but this little blue arrow will always point you to where that is. So if you needed to scroll, oh, I've got to scroll that way, or you can just click on it and it'll take you to it and zoom it in. It's like hitting O basically. So in our case though, we want to just go ahead and move that back. And I'll go ahead and hit O to zoom in so we can see. We'll just move that a little bit in front of our hour hand. All right, so we've got our hands there. We've got our poles sticking through. We are in good shape. Okay, let's go ahead and save. Now let's go ahead and create the clock face material. So we'll go ahead and double click down here. And we can do one over here. So let's go ahead and do one over here. So without double clicking the material, I can come up here. Now, if I want to change the name, I can just go to basic, and that's where the name is. I can also click down here, double click in just the name and change the name. So I could say clock face, right? And now if I come over here, I can see my color and reflectance, illumination. So anything that's turned on is here. So our basic also has what we have turned on. So in this case, I'm just going to turn on color again, turn off reflectance for now. So color, we are going to load in. So we need to hit that tab. And just like before, load in side of our clock bits folder. We want clock face, this PSD. All right. So I'll hit open. Yes, we want it in there. And now we can see we've got this clock face. So what I'm going to do is grab that, drag it up onto my clock face object over here in the object manager. And now we can see we've got a clock face going on. All right, so if I hit render, now we've got that. Now, if we look at it, everything should be good, except it's upside down, right? So, and it looks like, is it backwards? I think it's and it's backwards. Now, there's a couple ways we can do this. So we want to think about, why is this maybe doing this? So one way is the idea that maybe when we created, so right now this is still parametric, right? And that's okay. But what we want to do is look at, what if we change that from +Z to -Z? Now you can see everything is lined up. So what's happening is there are coordinates created, texture coordinates, as well as our coordinates for moving things. And with that plane in the +Z, the material was automatically mapping sort of to the back, right, to backwards. So in our case, we want to just, if we just flip that, we can go here, and we will get a lot more into this in texturing and texture mapping. But for now, I think that is fine and we'll be in good shape. Now you might say, you know, this is looking a little rough on the edge. So let's look and see how big we made that. Let's go ahead and take that up to maybe 102. All right, and that seems like that's okay. Now the other thing is, by default, everything has been UVW mapping. We'll talk about that later as well, but for now, we're just going to leave it. All I did was flip my clock face to -Z, and we are good to go as far as our render, right? So that's good. So now we've got hands, we've got a clock face, we've got numbers. We can go ahead and save again. So just Command S or Control S, or File, Save Project. And we're getting to a good spot. All right, so next up, let's create a material for the clock. All right, so if we come up here, we could say we want a metallic texture. So let's see how we might do that. So I'm going to double click, and this time I am going to double click it here again so we can see this. And we'll call this metal. And what we're going to use here, we're going to turn off our color, and we're just going to use reflectance. When Cinema creates a reflectance or a material, in reflectance, it's got what's called a default specular. In the old Cinema 4D material system, this was kind of, specular was how you created that highlight that a light intensity creates on an object, right? So that little bit of that reflection of just the intensity of the light, so that white highlight that we see. We don't need that anymore. They add it by default, but I always remove it immediately. So what I'm going to do is, again, click on the reflectance channel and then select this default specular and then hit remove. So now we've got an empty reflectance channel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, and I'm going to add a Beckman, our very first top one. So these are different algorithms for how materials react to light and different reflections and things like that inside of Cinema. So I'm going to do a Beckman. And we will get into this later with materials and dive deeper, but for this, in this case, just follow along. And so we've got that. Now you can see we've got some different things. So right now it's basically super chrome. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this up onto my clock. All right. And by default, Cinema gives us this sort of pseudo reflection area that we can kind of see in our viewport what's happening. So if I look at this and I can see that that's super shiny by default, and we've got a few things that we can change. So roughness is how smooth that chrome is. So if we look here, that's super smooth. If I bring this out to maybe 40%, we get more of a brushed metal look, right? So we can start to see how roughness, that affects us. All right, now we also have reflection strength. So if we don't want it super shiny like chrome, we can bring it down and bring in that reflection strength. With roughness, we can also, maybe bring it down a little bit more, 20, that looks good. Now, specular strength is that same thing I was talking about. I'm going to bring mine down to 0 to start, and we're going to rely purely on reflections. And then bump strength, that's if we have a bump map, we'll get into that later. And then we can also have a layer color. So let's say we wanted to add a little bit of maybe some brown or copper into this. Now you can see we can create a copper color all inside the reflectance. So I could come down here and lower how much influence that brightness of that has, right? And so now we can see we've got kind of a copper color. I'm going to make that a little brighter. There we go. That looks nice. Now, if I hit render now, we're not going to see anything. So we have this default light that is set up in Cinema 4D that is, giving us this illumination here in the front. If I look, but what's happening, this is reflective, but right now this is in a black void. There is nothing in this world that basically is available for the reflection to reflect. So we're going to create a sky object and add a material that will give us some of that information. So I'm going to go ahead and close this material right now. And I'm going to come in here, create a new material. We'll call that sky. And I want to create a sky object. So up here, I can click where this floor is and come down here and hit sky. So a sky object is basically a big sphere that just encompasses the world. And now in my sky material, I'm going to come in here to color. We're going to load in this texture Seraphantine 6D clear 2K. It's an HDR because what we can do, we can use this for lighting as well. I'm going to hit yes. And now we can see it's this image of a horizon with a sun. And if we drag this onto the sky, suddenly when we hit render, we've got reflections. Things look a lot better. We can get our little highlight here from where that sun object is. It's obviously behind us, but this object is in the world, right, of this desert. And we maybe don't want that, but we just want this illusion of these highlights and lights. So what we can do is we can use what's called a compositing tag. And in Cinema, we already looked at tags here. We've got our material tags. UVW tags are created once we make something editable. So that's what these are. These are Phong tags, which talk about how much smoothing happens inside Cinema with geometry. But so if we come over here to tags, you can see all these tags. We have animation tags. I've got Octane tags because I have Octane. I've got Corona tags because I use Corona, MoGraph tags, all these things. The ones we'll be using a lot will be camera tags and render tags right now. So if I come to render tags, I want to come down here and click on compositing. And what this does, it allows us to object by object sort of say what happens to objects in this scene. So right here, whether I want it to cast shadows, receive shadows, seen by the camera, seen by rays, etc. So in this case, the sky, we don't want the camera to see it, but we do want it to be seen by rays. And what rays is basically lighting, right? And we also want it to be seen by reflection and refraction. So now if I hit render, we'll get our black background, but we get our sky reflection. Right now we can see this looks a little rough. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my render settings up here. And while we're in the standard renderer, all right, we've got multiple renderers we can use. We've got standard and physical, and then you also have Pro Render built into Cinema. I have Corona and Octane installed on this machine, but you should have standard, physical, viewport, and Corona. When you're in standard renderer, anti-aliasing plays a big part. So if we click on anti-aliasing, this will tell us how much smoothing is happening sort of post, right? So by default, it's set to geometry, which is, rough. It's great for previews. But what I'm going to do is move it to best. And we're going to take a look now. It takes a little bit longer to render, but now look, all that sort of some of those highlights and weird little jaggies on our alpha channel, those are all gone. This is much smoother. A lot of that noise is out of there. So you can see right there, that really helps a lot. So another thing we can do inside the render settings while we're in here, again, output, what size you want your final output to be, and then resolution of that. If you're doing video, again, what your aspect ratio is, and then how many frames will be rendered, the current frame or all frames. Save is where you're saving it, what name you're saving it as, and what format. Anti-aliasing, and we'll get into some of these others later, but that'll work there. So we already know if we hit render view, this renders in the viewport. If we hit render to picture viewer, it renders over to the picture viewer, and from here we can save it out, file, save image as, save it as whatever you want. And then we also, in here, if we pull this down, we've got an interactive render region. So this is a great way to sort of preview what's going on, and it'll render that area, and you can just adjust it. This little slider over here is the quality. So here it's, really low quality. Up here it's higher quality, but it takes a little longer to update. So, in the middle usually is okay, depending on the speed of your machine. And so we could start looking at this and say, all right, let me go back to my metal material here. I'm going to select this, double click it, and I can come into my reflectance channel. And let's see, what if I do take that roughness down to maybe 10%? All right, so it's a crisper, right? We lose some of that noise, some of that. Maybe I'm bringing my reflectance strength up, so it's a lot shinier, right? So we can really see what's going on there. So this is a good way to do some tests and see what's happening. All right, and then our specular strength, if we want to bring that up a little, you can see where that starts to affect a little bit more on these highlights. It starts to pop a little more, all right? Down here especially. So now if we render to see what that looks like, there we go. So there's a nice little render. Now, the light that we are using is the default light. Later on, we'll get into how we can use that sky to light our scene. Right now, there's a default light. That's where our camera is, and that is lighting the scene. Now, when we're in our standard renderer, if we create a new light, that will turn off our default light. In other render engines, we may have to turn that default light off, and we'll cover that when we get to it. But let's now create a light. So first off, let's create a floor. So this object here is a floor object, and it will basically give us an infinite floor. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off my interactive render region right here, IRR, and go to my front view, and we can either move our clock up or we can move our floor down, however you want to do it. I'm going to go ahead and move my floor down. So I'm going to select my floor and make sure I'm on my model tool and move this down right so it lines up. That looks good. So we can take a look. So now we've got our floor. We can see the horizon because this is basically an infinite floor. But we're not getting any shadows. We're not getting a lot of things here that we would expect to see in a view because our default light doesn't have shadows turned on, And we are not lighting with the sky. These are just reflections showing up. So what we need to do is create a new light. So our lights are right up here. And I am going to create a target light. And a target light, if I click that, what it is, it's a light that has a target tag. And inside this target tag, you can say target object, and there's light.target.one, and that's a null object, which is just a point, right? And that is where it's going to always point. So if I grab that null and I say, start moving it, you can see the light moves and follows it. I'll undo, put that back at 0. So then if we move our light, so if I go up to my light here and I'm in my move tool, you can see now my light will always face that target. Now this is a pretty nice way of positioning lights, all right? And by default, this light is is a spotlight, and we can see if we render, we get a spotlight, okay? And that light just sort of dies inside of that spot. And if I click on that light, we can look at a few of the settings here. So this might be another good place to set up our interactive render region. All right, so we can see what's happening. Now, if I zoom in a little bit, I've just moved my light, so I've got a little angle here. We can see what's happening there. If we look at our light options, so the first tab is general. This is our spot. Intensity is how dark or bright that light is. We can also down here have shadow, so we can turn shadows on. So if we say shadow map soft is not a physically accurate shadow, but a lot of times it looks pretty, good enough. So again, if we render this now, there we go. We've got some light. We've got shadow. Now we're getting this reflection from our scene. So you could always rotate your sky. You might find a scene that's a little more appropriate. You can also set up, you can get studio HDRIs or studio images that just have like lights in certain places, or you can create your own. We'll do that. I'll do a tutorial on that later. But in this case, I think this is fine for this tutorial, but you can see we get our nice extended shadow. If we also come down here, now light type, that's the first one. It's spot here, but we could also make that an omni. And an omni is like a point light. So light is emanating from 360 degrees. So if we render this, we can see there's a lot more. It's going out everywhere. It's not as focused, obviously, as a spotlight, which is like a flashlight or a spotlight. We also have an infinite light, which is basically like the sun. So an infinite light will be all the rays are going in one direction, and that's along the z-axis. And that basically will create a very sharp shadow. It's very used often to simulate the sun. And then we have area lights, which gives your light a nice shape. So it can be more like a soft box. And you can see even here, it's spreading that shadow out a little more, and that's there. Now, inside shadows, we also have area shadows, which are the most physically accurate. So now we can see that that's creating a really nice blurred shadow, but it did take a little longer to render. So you can play around with these and try your types, but I'm going to go back to my spotlight and my soft shadow just for this, for speed. So now if we come down, there's also visible light, and what visible light will do, well, you'll see that cone of light. So now if I sort of extend this out, if I render, you can see we get that visible light. There's also volumetric light, which allows shadows to actually be cast inside that. And we'll get into that again later. So I'm going to turn off that visible light, none. Okay, great. There's also some things here. You can have the light affect or not affect the specular. So you can see up here these two little dots. A couple of these dots are from the light. That's that specular I'm talking about. Yes or no on affecting it, right? So you might not want those harsh highlights from your light, or you might want them in there. So that's a way you can get rid of that quickly if you want to. The other big thing here would be details. where you can have your outer angle, right? How wide that spotlight is. That spreads out. You also have an inner angle. So if you want this to have sort of an inside, you can see that blur, that inner angle will be full light. When it's down to 0, your light starts lessening as it gets out to the edge. Inner angle, you can increase that. And then we also have fall off. And fall off is what gives you that realistic fall off of light to the edge. And if we turn this on, we want to use inverse square, which is more physically accurate. And now you can immediately see that we've got a much nicer light here. And then that fall off, here's our radius and decay. And also all of these, let me turn off my interactive render region here. All of these things can also be controlled by some of our settings here. So if I come here and click this, there's my outer angle, right? If I come here to my fall off, we can set that as well as how much fall off that happens there. So that's some really, really great stuff that you can do. And we can get a lot of the shadow details and things, but in this case, this is fine. This will work for us. And we can go back to our light, move tool, maybe we want it a little more above. And that's our light. So what I'm going to do though, is let's make this light, I'm going to go back to general and make this maybe 75%. Another thing we didn't talk about is color of the light. So we can also give it a little warmth. So if I come into my yellow here, maybe give it a hint, and you can see really quickly how that gives us a nice warm glow. Maybe we want to go cool. We can add a cool light to it. So again, setting moods with lights, just like photography, you can really start to set a lot of stuff up. So if I look at my 4-way view again and I zoom out, right now this is straight on. I'm going to hit this light, move it over to the side, and let's see how that looks. Okay, that gives us, that's a little more exciting, right? We've got our fall off here. We can sort of move this so we get a little closer. Oh yeah, that's looking good. Now we might need, so maybe that's our key light. So we might need a little fill light over on this side though, just to add a little volume to this, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste, Command or Control C, Command Control V. And on the first light we just did, let's call that our key light. And then here on the second, let's do our fill light. On that fill light, I'm going to select that and just move that over, maybe over here. And by default, that's still at 75, but I'm going to take that down to 50. So we get a little difference, and let's see how that looks. All right, so now we've got a little more light. Maybe I want to move this up a little, and maybe we need a little more light into that actual face to get some of that to light up. So that could be maybe our key, take that up to 100, see how that looks. Okay, that's looking better. All right. Now, right now we get 2 sets of shadows. So you may want that for that realistic, or you could also just come in and let me get my fill light up maybe a little bit more. Come in and then you could just turn off on maybe that fill light. Say, I don't want any shadows. So I'm going to go to shadow, none. And then we're faking the render, but we get the shadow where we want, but we still get a little bit of that fill. We could also come in here and maybe we don't want the fill light to affect the floor. We just want it to affect our object. So we can come into fill light. And if we come down here and hit the project tab, you've got exclude and include. So I could say, I don't want this, I want this to exclude, and just drag the floor object in there. Now you can see that light vanish there. It still lights our clock, but it doesn't light the floor. So we can still have that lonely clock in its little view, right? Going for that. Now let's say this is where I wanted this to be, and I, really like this shot right here. I want a little bit of that loneliness. Maybe I'm going to rotate around. Right now we're just using our default camera. and I want to set a camera. So what I can do, and let's save. I haven't saved in a while. I apologize. File, save project. And I love this view. So what I'm going to do is set a camera. So I'm just come over here, add camera object. Now, by default, we've got our camera, but we're not using it now. If I move around, so we can see if I zoom out from the top, here's our camera. If I move around in my viewport, our camera doesn't move. Okay, so I can move around and set another view in a camera. But if I want to get back to that camera view, what I want to do is just click on this little square and that'll bring it in. But if I move now with that selected, you can see it moves our camera, right? So make sure that, you know, if you want to use this and you set up your thing and you're like, this is the perfect view, this is where another tag can come in handy. It's a protection tag. So we want to use another tag here. Go to tags. In here, it's in rigging tags, which would be more character animation, but protection. What this does is now I can't move this in the viewport, right? I can't do anything with this while that's on. So what's great about that is that you can set that and not do it. Now, if you want to use it, you can always delete it, or you could just grab it and move it and then move it back. But the protection tag is your friend. That'll set that up and we can render and see where we're at. Okay. So that's our view. And then maybe we want to do another view. So I'm going to unclick that box. So I'm back here and maybe I want to go to something a little more dramatic. So I don't know, maybe something really weird like this. Okay. And so we're there. Now the other thing, let's take a look at that. Okay. We can see that glass reflection there, right? So another thing we can do though, let's add another camera. All right, so I've got my camera here. Now again, when you create a camera, it will be in the view port that you select. So if I was over here in my top view and I created a camera, it would create a top view camera. So always make sure that you're in the view you want to make your camera, create our camera. And then what you could do is let's use that camera. Okay, so we'll go use. And you can also come down here and start looking at some of your other objects here in the camera. So we could go for a super wide, right, camera and start getting some really bizarre looks like this, almost fisheye. You could come in here and go for maybe a super long lens, right? So maybe we want to straighten everything out and want it to look really crisp. So you're doing some packaging. So maybe we'd come out to maybe a 200. Let's take it out a little more. So that's a 135. I like to shoot with a 200. Now, if we pull out here, we can see that we got a nice long lens, right? So we can drag that out, bring it up a little. Now that really kind of keeps all of our lines. So that could be more of a product shot there. So again, we could have our two cameras and set them up. And then if you want to jump back and forth, there's that shot. And maybe let's go something here. All right. And then that's that shot. Boom, boom, boom. And if you like that shot, go ahead and put a protection tag on it. And once you have a tag though, you can always just Command or Control drag, click and drag, and that'll copy a tag. So now we've got two protection tags, everything will render, and we're in good shape. All right. One other, let's see, I think that's kind of that. Let's talk about rendering it out. So I'll go back, turn off this camera here for a second. And we've got our materials, we've got our lights, we've set up everything. So now what we can do, let's put a material on the ground. We didn't do that. So let's say, okay, so what we're going to do now, let's create that texture for our floor real quick. We're going to go ahead and click on material. Let's call it floor. And instead of just a solid color, let's go ahead and use a surface. So I'm going to click on this texture here, roll down to surfaces, and we can grab a tile. All right, there's some defaults here. So if we come in here to tiles, we can change it up. You've got grout color, tile colors. You can do different patterns. So if you want to do some like circles, you can either come in and do a randomized color. Well, you'll get different variations based on your colors here. So I'm going to go ahead and just say, let's go with some grays. So I'm going to go black. We've got that copper color, so maybe we'll throw a little red in the mix and see what that looks like. That's kind of fun. Maybe a little oranger. I don't know. All right, so we've got something there. And then let's drag that onto our floor object. So we can just drop it here and take a peek. All right, so we've got our floor. We've got a little texture on there. Let me get to try a different view here. Okay, so we've got our little tile. If you need to change that size, we could bring this back up and we could come in here and say global scale. We could take that up to 300%. All right, now we've got bigger circles, and that's where you can adjust that. And that gives a little extra something. All right. Well, that's basically that. I know this was a long tutorial. Let's just talk about one last time of how to get these out. So I'm going to go to my render settings. I'm going to say output. What have I got? 1280 by 720. That seems fine. Another thing to know is when you're rendering, these little edges are where your render view is in that viewport. So let's say I went to 1280 by 1280. Now you can see this darker edge will not be rendered when we render to picture viewer. So if I render to picture viewer, we can see we get our square, but that darker edge was where it was. Now, if you're having trouble seeing that, you can change that. If we come up into select a view and we want to go to mode in that window, view settings, and we can come in here and go to view. Let me remember where this is. Render safe. Okay, so that's where we're at there, our render safe. And you can change this. So if I wanted to make this maybe a red, something like that. And that might be a little too much. Maybe bring it down a little bit. But again, depending on what you need there, bring that opacity down. That can help you a lot with changing that. So right there, viewport, so mode, view settings, and then save frames. And then you can change your color in here. And then that will give you that. Now it won't show up when you render, but it'll let you know when I go to picture viewer, that's the area rendering. All right. And so basically there we've got our settings. That's what we're doing, 1280 by 1280. Resolution, if you knew you were going to print, you needed 300, you could change that there, and that will just multiply it out. So if we do 300 here, that will give us that. It'll make it at 300. So I'm going to go back to 72. We've got you can render region. So we'll get into that later. All of this current frame is what we're doing because we're going to still save. If you want to save it out automatically, this is where you could say where you want it. I can go ahead and throw it into my same folder. And maybe I'm going to call it clock 01, save. And I want it to be a PSD. So Photoshop document. And I want that to be 16 bits so I can do some color correction. And that'll be great. And then anti-aliasing again, check that. Maybe you want to crank it up a little bit if you want, just for the final render. And I think that's good for now. So if we come in, we hit render to picture viewer. Now that'll render it, as well as, since we had save and we gave it a spot, it will also put it inside of our folder. And there it is. All right. And we can load that to Photoshop and do some color correction, cropping, etc. All right. Well, I hope that helped to get Red up and running and getting to know a little bit about lights and rendering and textures. And again, there'll be more tutorials that dig deeper into all of these aspects, but just to get you making something, I think that that's a great first step and a way to just sort of feel your way around cinema. It's a really big program. It's really deep. And you'll find people do things many different ways. And even just, using shortcuts or using the materials in the window versus, double clicking it and creating its own window or in the attributes manager. All these things are different ways. There's not right or wrong. It just depends on your workflow and how you feel using it. So, and keep having fun, and thanks for watching.